You are not too damaged for God to use you. We tend to think that we are far too damaged for God to use us because it's a natural thought that kind of flows from the idea that God is holy and perfect and we are not. And so as we develop our relationship with him and as we grow closer to him, it gives us an additional reason for us to look at ourselves and think, I am not enough. So many of us approach God even though we learn how much he loves us and how he chooses us and how he cares for us and has a plan for us. We still approach him as if he's looking at us for some reason that he could find to disqualify us. And so typically we're going to disqualify ourselves before we even get in the game, not knowing that God has precisely planned for you to be used for his glory, and you keep taking yourself out. There's two types of ideas that I really want to talk about that I feel stem from the idea of being far too damaged for God to use us. And the first one is that I'm too damaged because of my past. Immediately, I think of a perfect person in the Bible who could have said this to God, who could have said, you know what? I love you and I've given my life to you at this point, but my past was crazy. There's no possible way that you could use me. Not only that, but I'm actually against the idea of you using me because of everything that I did in my past. And yet that person went on to become somebody that God used so greatly. And his name is Paul. The idea that because you have a past, God can't use you could not be further from the truth. Actually, in in the book of Acts, wow, why can't I say it? In the book of Acts, chapter 9, we see where Saul becomes Paul and he gets saved. And the funniest part about that is Jesus opening up the heavens to speak to him and saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's almost as if God was saying to him, why are you doing something that directly opposes what you've been called for? And so you might be looking at your past and thinking, I was against God and I lived a life in complete and total opposition to him. Who am I to even be approached by him to be used? That there's no way that God could possibly have a plan and a purpose for me. But he does. You see, God takes a man that literally persecuted the church, was out there killing Christians like it was a sport. And he uses that man to write more than 50% of the New Testament and to literally be the one who goes out and plants churches, encourages churches, writes letters to churches that show them how to live out their faith. How crazy is it that he went from taking life to giving life? A lot of times, the very things that you went through, the very things that you suffered through, the very things that you used against God are used by him for his glory. Listen, you might be out here disqualifying yourself from doing things for God that he precisely wants you to do for him. Paul was so against God, but then God approaches him and completely changes his life. Are you accepting the change that God is putting into your heart that transforms you into the person that can carry that calling? You are not too damaged. If anything, the afflictions, pain, and brokenness that you experienced are all pieces that can be used by him for his glory. Will you allow him to use those broken pieces? Or do you feel like you needed to be perfect in order to be used? If you feel like you needed to be perfect to be used, then your name would have been Jesus, and he was used to make a way for you and me, even though we're broken. Another idea that comes up for me when it comes to feeling like you're too damaged is I'm far too damaged because I'll never be enough. I'll never be able to live up to this call or live up to God's standard for my life. So how could I possibly step into serving others for his glory? Or how could I be in ministry? Or how can I speak his name out in public at my job or at school or whatever the case may be? And I want to tell you that God is the one who can take an overlooked boy and turn him into a king. See, God took David, another great character in the Bible, a man who was overlooked by so many, and turns him into the most prolific king of Israel's history, aside from Jesus. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, we see that Jesse, David's father, is presenting his sons to Samuel, who's the prophet that comes to anoint one of his sons, saying like, yo, one of your sons is meant to be king. And Jesse's like, oh, here's my son, here's my son, here's my son. The scripture actually says Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel to be anointed. And Samuel had to say to him, you don't have any other sons? That clearly tells me that Jesse himself overlooked David. And it couldn't have been just the fact that David was out in the field tending to what he needed to tend to. No, because if that were the case, he would have sent for him like he did after that. But he just overlooked him. And he overlooked him because he was the youngest, or maybe because he wasn't as good as his older brothers. And whatever the reason was, his own father overlooked him. And there might be people in this world who have overlooked you, and that might have made you feel like you lack something, like you don't have what it takes to be able to do what God is calling you to. But I want to tell you today, I want to tell you that God is in the business of taking what you have and multiplying it. Just because others have overlooked you, it does not mean that God does. God can take your heart and mold your character into who he is calling you to be. If you would just believe today, if you would take your heart and give it to him and say, Lord, I feel far too damaged. I feel like my past is just way too much. I feel like I'll never be enough, and I've been overlooked by so many people. And you know what? You're saying you want to use me, so I'm just going to give this to you. If you would take that step of faith, I firmly believe that God will meet you where you are. You just need to stop taking yourself out, disqualifying yourself, and pushing yourself out of rooms that God has called you to be in, all because you don't think you can measure up. God is the one who makes you measure up. God is the one who lifts you up for the occasion so that you can serve him and you can be who he's called you to be. So I want to encourage you today. I want to encourage you to believe today, or believe again, that God has a plan and a purpose for your life, and that you are not too damaged for God to do a work through your life. God bless you guys. I hope you enjoyed this short video, and I hope you have an amazing week. Peace.